In 1636, a single tulip bulb sold for the price of a mansion in Amsterdam. Not a bouquet, not a garden, one bulb. Buyers were convinced that tulips represented not just beauty, but wealth that would grow forever. Within months, the market collapsed. Fortunes vanished overnight. Families were ruined. Nearly 4 centuries later, in 2008, the world watched as millions of Americans lost their homes in a housing crash that triggered a global financial crisis. Banks collapsed. Economies froze. Governments scrambled to prevent total meltdown. And yet, here's what they didn't tell you. 2008 wasn't the crisis. It was the warning. The pattern that destroyed lives in 2008 is playing out again right now, only bigger, more global, and far more dangerous. Because this time, it's not just subprime mortgages in American suburbs. It's a synchronized mania spanning continents, fueled by money printing on a scale never seen in human history. This is the 8-stage pattern of land mania. It is repeated for centuries, from Dutch tulips to British railroads to Japanese real estate to American housing. Each time, people convince themselves this time is different. Each time, they're wrong. And each time, the collapse follows the same 8 stages, as predictable as a script, as devastating as a tsunami. Stage 1 is always the same: easy money. Land manias don't start because land suddenly becomes scarce or more useful. They start because credit becomes cheap and abundant. When interest rates fall, when banks are eager to lend, when money floods the system, people start looking for places to put it. And throughout history, one of the most seductive destinations has always been land and property. Why? Because land feels solid, permanent, real. Stocks can crash, currencies can collapse, but land is always there. You can see it, touch it, build on it. It's the ultimate psychological anchor in an uncertain world. The setup for the current mania began after the 2008 crisis itself. Central banks around the world, terrified of another Great Depression, slashed interest rates to 0, and then kept them there for over a decade. They printed trillions through quantitative easing. Money became almost free to borrow. In the United States, mortgage rates fell to historic lows, below 3% for a 30-year loan. In Europe, rates went negative. Banks were literally paying people to borrow money. In China, the government encouraged lending to keep the economy growing, and shadow banking exploded. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, cheap credit flowed like water. This wasn't careful, targeted stimulus. It was a fire hose of money pointed at the entire global economy. And when you flood an economy with cheap credit, people don't save it. They borrow and spend it. And the easiest thing to borrow against, the most attractive investment when money is cheap, is always real estate. Stage 1 creates the conditions. But it's stage 2 where the mania begins to build initial price gains. When money is cheap, buyers enter the market. First-time homebuyers who couldn't afford a house at 6% interest suddenly can at 3%. Investors, looking for returns in a world where bonds pay nothing, start buying rental properties. Foreign buyers park capital in stable real estate markets. Demand increases. Prices start rising, and at first, everyone has a reasonable explanation. The economy is growing. Population is increasing. Cities are expanding. Millennials are finally buying homes. There's a housing shortage. Interest rates are low, making homes more affordable. All of these explanations sound rational. And in the beginning, they are. The first wave of price increases is usually justified by fundamentals. But here's where human psychology takes over. Once prices start rising, people notice. Your neighbor buys a house for $300,000. 2 years later, it's worth $350,000. He didn't do anything, he just owned it. That's $50,000 in profit for doing nothing. You start thinking, if I bought 2 years ago, I'd be richer. And if prices keep rising, waiting will only make me poorer. The fear of missing out, FOMO, begins to override rational calculation. This is stage 3. the narrative takes hold. Every mania needs a story, a collective delusion that makes it seem reasonable. And land manias always generate the same narratives, just with different details. In the Dutch tulip mania, the story was that tulips were a luxury good that would always be in demand among Europe's wealthy elite. In the British railway mania of the 1840s, the story was that railroads would revolutionize commerce, and every rail company would be profitable. In Japan in the 1980s, the story was that Japanese land was uniquely scarce and valuable. At one point, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were theoretically worth more than all of California. After 2008, the narrative in America was, they're not making any more land. Millennials are a huge generation that needs housing, and low interest rates have permanently changed affordability. In China, the narrative was urbanization will continue for decades. Hundreds of millions will move from countryside to cities, and real estate is the only reliable store of wealth in a system where the government controls everything else. In Canada and Australia, the story was, we have immigration-driven population growth, limited land in desirable cities, and foreign buyers will always want stability. Every one of these narratives contained some truth. That's what makes them dangerous. They're not completely false, they're selectively true, emphasizing factors that support rising prices while ignoring risks. And once the narrative takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. Media coverage shifts from cautious to celebratory. Television shows about house flipping proliferate. Dinner party conversations revolve around real estate gains. People who bought early are treated as geniuses. People who didn't buy are treated as fools. The narrative creates social pressure. Not owning property starts to feel like financial and social failure. And that pressure drives even skeptical people into the market, because sitting out means being left behind. This brings us to stage 4. Leverage and speculation explode. In the early stages, people buy property to live in or rent out for income. But as prices keep rising, the psychology shifts. Property stops being a place to live and becomes a vehicle for speculation. And speculation is always fueled by leverage, borrowed money. Here's why leverage is so seductive in a rising market. If you buy a $300,000 house with a $60,000 down payment, and the price rises 10% to $330,000, you haven't made 10%. You've made 50% on your invested capital. Your $60,000 down payment turned into $90,000 in equity. This mathematical magic makes leverage irresistible during a boom. Why buy one property with cash when you can buy 5 with mortgages if prices are going up 10% a year? Leverage multiplies your returns. And so people stretch. They buy second homes, investment properties, vacation rentals. Developers borrow to build luxury condos in cities already saturated with supply. Investors form syndicates to buy apartment buildings they've never seen in cities they've never visited. In the years before 2008, this stage reached absurd extremes. Ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets, were common. People with no ability to repay were given mortgages because the assumption was that rising prices would solve everything. If the borrower couldn't pay, the lender could just foreclose and sell the house for a profit. After 2008, regulators claimed they'd fixed this. Lending standards tightened, in theory. But in practice, the cheap money from central banks found other ways into real estate. In the United States, institutional investors bought tens of thousands of single-family homes. In Canada and Australia, households took on record debt levels. In China, developers borrowed trillions to build entire ghost cities. The leverage never went away. It just moved and mutated. By stage 5, the mania reaches its peak. Prices detach from reality. There's a metric called the price-to-income ratio. It measures how expensive housing is relative to what people actually earn. Historically, in healthy markets, median home prices are about 3 to 4 times median household income. That's sustainable. People can afford mortgages without destroying their finances. But during manias, this ratio explodes. In the peak of the 2008 bubble, some American cities hit ratios of 7 or 8 to 1. In Vancouver and Toronto today, ratios exceed 10 to 1. In cities like Hong Kong and Sydney, they've reached 15 to 1 or higher. At these levels, housing is not affordable to people who work normal jobs. Teachers, nurses, engineers, middle-class professionals cannot buy homes in the cities where they work without either massive debt, family help, or speculative risk-taking. But prices keep rising anyway, because buyers aren't purchasing based on income or rental yields anymore. They're buying based on the expectation that someone else will pay even more tomorrow. This is the textbook definition of a speculative bubble. Prices sustained not by fundamental value, but by the belief in future price increases. You see the same insanity in rental markets. Investors buy properties where the rent doesn't even cover the mortgage payment, accepting negative cash flow because they're betting on appreciation. That's not investing. That's speculation with a real estate wrapper. The absurdity becomes visible everywhere. Tear-down houses, barely livable structures, sell for millions because the land underneath is valuable. Parking spaces in major cities sell for 6 figures. People line up overnight to enter lotteries for the right to buy a condo that hasn't been built yet. And anyone who points out the insanity is dismissed. You don't understand. This city is special. There's limited land. Everyone wants to live here. Prices can't fall because there will always be demand. The narrative has become so embedded that questioning it seems foolish. But stage 6 is inevitable. The warning signs appear. Manias never end cleanly or predictably, but they always leave clues before the crash. The problem is that during the mania, everyone ignores the clues. Sales volume starts declining. Prices are still rising, but fewer transactions are happening. Why? Because at peak prices, the pool of buyers who can afford to enter the market shrinks. You need constantly expanding demand to sustain rising prices, but eventually you run out of greater fools. Inventory begins building. In healthy markets, homes sell quickly, but as prices peak, listings sit longer. Sellers, still convinced their property is worth bubble prices, refuse to lower their asking prices. The gap between what sellers want and what buyers will pay starts widening. Mortgage delinquencies tick up. When times are good and prices are rising, even borrowers stretched thin can survive by refinancing or selling at a profit. But when prices flatten, those options disappear. People who took on too much debt start falling behind. New construction peaks. Developers, seeing profits in real estate, rush to build. But construction takes time. By the time projects are completed, the market has often already turned. Ghost developments, empty luxury condos, half-built subdivisions start appearing. Media sentiment shifts. The cheerleading articles about hot markets give way to cautionary pieces. Is the market cooling? Are we in a bubble? Even if the mainstream view is still bullish, cracks in the narrative appear. Before 2008, all these signs were visible by 2006. Sales slowed. Inventory spiked. Subprime delinquencies rose. But the consensus was that any correction would be mild. A soft landing. The idea of a systemic collapse seemed impossible. Today, similar signs are appearing globally. Chinese property developers are defaulting on billions in debt. Canadian household debt is at record highs. American home affordability is the worst it's been in decades. In many markets, prices have paused or started declining, but the narrative persists. This time is different. We have a genuine supply shortage. Interest rates will stay low. Governments won't let the market crash. And that brings us to stage 7, the trigger. Bubbles don't need a dramatic external shock to collapse. They're inherently unstable. But there's usually a catalyst, a moment when confidence cracks and the psychology reverses. In 2008, the trigger was subprime mortgage defaults. When even a small percentage of borrowers started failing to pay, it exposed the fragility of the entire system. Banks holding mortgage-backed securities suddenly didn't know what they owned. Credit markets froze. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Fear spread globally. The trigger is impossible to predict in advance. It could be an interest rate hike that makes debt unaffordable. It could be a major bank or developer going bankrupt. It could be a geopolitical crisis that shifts investor sentiment. It could be something seemingly small, a regulatory change, a high-profile foreclosure, a scandal that breaks the spell. What matters is not the trigger itself, but the underlying fragility. If the system is healthy, it can absorb shocks. But if it's over-leveraged, overvalued, and dependent on perpetually rising prices, even a small shock can cascade into catastrophe. Right now, the global system is more leveraged than it was before 2008. Global debt, government, corporate, and household combined, exceeds $300 trillion, more than 3 times global GDP. Much of that debt is directly or indirectly tied to real estate. Interest rates have started rising after more than a decade near zero. That alone could be the trigger. When rates rise, monthly mortgage payments rise. Fewer people can afford to buy, demand drops, prices fall. And falling prices destroy the entire logic of the mania. When the trigger comes, and it always comes, stage 8 begins the collapse. This is where the real damage happens, and it follows a predictable, brutal pattern. First, denial. Prices start falling, but buyers and sellers both convince themselves it's temporary. Just a correction. Wait for spring. The market always picks up. The government will step in. People hold out, refusing to accept the new reality. But denial gives way to panic. More sellers list properties, desperate to get out before prices fall further. But buyers have vanished. Who wants to catch a falling knife? Inventory explodes. Prices drop faster. Leverage turns into a death spiral. Owners who bought at the peak with minimal down payments find themselves underwater, owing more on their mortgage than the house is worth. They can't sell without taking a loss. They can't refinance because banks won't lend on a depreciating asset. Some walk away, handing keys to the bank. Foreclosures flood the market, driving prices down further. Speculators and investors who bought multiple properties with leverage are wiped out. They default on mortgages, declare bankruptcy, or lose everything trying to hold on. Banks, holding mortgages and real estate assets, suffer massive losses. In 2008, major financial institutions collapsed. Governments had to step in with trillion-dollar bailouts to prevent total system failure. The real economy crumbles. Construction workers lose jobs. Real estate agents, mortgage brokers, appraisers, entire industries built around the mania collapse. Consumer spending drops because people feel poorer. Businesses fail. Unemployment rises. The psychological shift is just as important as the economic one. The narrative that drove the mania, real estate always goes up, buy now or be priced out forever, is exposed as a lie. People who lost everything become bitter and cautious. An entire generation learns to fear debt and distrust the system. And here's the cruelest part. The people who suffer most are not the speculators or the bankers. They're ordinary families who bought at the peak because they believed the narrative. They needed a place to live, they trusted that the system was sound, and they ended up losing their savings, their homes, and their futures. After 2008, millions of Americans were foreclosed on. Families who'd lived in their homes for years were evicted. Neighborhoods turned into ghost towns with boarded-up houses and overgrown lawns. Entire communities were destroyed. And globally, the pattern was the same. In Ireland and Spain, housing bubbles burst, leaving countries with massive debt and empty developments. In Japan in the 1990s, the real estate collapse created a lost decade of stagnation that actually lasted 30 years. So where are we now in 2025? The warning signs are everywhere. Housing affordability in major cities around the world is at historic lows. Debt levels are at record highs. Central banks, after years of keeping rates near zero, have been forced to raise them to fight inflation. Cracks are appearing. Developer defaults in China, price declines in Canada and New Zealand, inventory building in the United States. The leverage is extreme. The valuations are detached from fundamentals. The narrative is still holding, but it's starting to fray. 2008 taught us that housing bubbles can collapse, that financial systems are fragile, that the damage can be global and catastrophic. But we didn't learn the deeper lesson. We didn't change the system. We just papered over the problem with more cheap money, more debt, more speculation. And now the pattern is playing out again, only bigger. The bubble isn't confined to one country or one type of mortgage. It's global. It's in residential real estate, commercial real estate, and infrastructure. It's fueled by central bank money printing on a scale that makes 2008 look modest. When this bubble bursts, and it will, because bubbles always burst, the damage will make 2008 look like a warning shot. The 8 stages are timeless. Easy money, rising prices, narrative formation, leverage explosion, detachment from reality, warning signs, the trigger, and collapse. Tulips, railroads, Japanese land, American suburbs. The asset changes, but the pattern doesn't. What should you take away from this? First, understand that housing is not always a safe investment. The idea that real estate only goes up is one of the most expensive lies in financial history. It goes up during manias, and it crashes during collapses. Second, recognize the pattern. If you see prices rising faster than incomes, if you see extreme leverage, if you see a narrative that sounds too good to question, you're in a bubble. It doesn't matter what the experts say, what your neighbors are doing, or how much you fear missing out. Third, debt is the killer. Leverage amplifies gains in a rising market, but it destroys you in a falling one. The people who survive crashes are the ones who can weather the storm because they're not overextended. And fourth, don't trust governments or central banks to prevent the collapse. They'll try. They'll cut rates, print money, bail out banks, but they can't stop the underlying dynamics. Bubbles burst not because of policy failures, but because they're mathematically unsustainable. The housing extinction pattern is real. 2008 was just the warning. The next collapse will be worse because the bubble is bigger, the leverage is greater, and the consequences are global. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The patterns never lie. You just have to recognize them before it's too late.